Imagine this. One morning, tens of millions of people each hold a folded piece of paper and stand in line. One by one, they place that paper into a box. That is all. No guns, no armies, no physical force of any kind. And yet, by the following morning, depending on what those boxes contain, a government may fall or survive. Isn't that a little strange? A piece of paper cannot stop a tank. A ballot carries no physical force whatsoever. So why do millions of people, even people holding guns, bow their heads before the result of these scraps of paper? This is, in fact, something remarkably new and unfamiliar in the long arc of human history. For most of that history, power moved through blood, inherited through lineage, seized by the sword, defended by armies. The idea that a single folded sheet of paper held by an ordinary person could outweigh an entire nation's military is a recent one. And in many countries, it was won only after long struggle and sacrifice. That is why the vote is not simply a procedure. It is also a symbol, hard-earned. This video is about the right to vote. More precisely, it is about what force that single piece of paper actually carries, and what happens when someone tries to break it. Voting is not power, it is a promise. The power of a ballot does not reside in the paper itself. It lives inside a promise. Democracy is a promise made by an entire society. That power will be transferred not through force, but through numbers. Instead of settling who is stronger by fighting, we agreed to settle who is more widely wanted by counting. The ballot is that promise made visible, a countable token that carries one person's will. At the center of this promise is a quiet miracle called concession. The losing side, rather than picking up weapons or setting streets on fire, accepts defeat and steps aside. There is no physical force anywhere in the world that can compel the stronger party to surrender power. There is only the agreement that everyone has made to do so. Democracy stands on the belief that this agreement will be honored, every time. And here lies the paradox of voting. It is simultaneously the most powerful and the most fragile institution in the world. Powerful because even presidents and generals must stand down before its results. Fragile because its power rests on a single condition: that everyone continues to agree to accept the outcome. The moment that agreement breaks, a ballot becomes just paper again. And looking at history, attempts to break that agreement have always come from two directions. One attacking from above, by those who hold power, and one attacking from below, by those who have lost it. Let's look at each in turn. The first method, stealing the count. The first method belongs to those who already hold power. They falsify the results of the count itself. The ritual of voting proceeds as normal. People stand in line, mark their ballots, place them in the box. But at the moment the papers are tallied, the real numbers are quietly replaced with false ones. The most recent and most brazen example is Venezuela in 2024. In July 2024, Venezuela held a presidential election, a contest between long-ruling Nicolas Maduro and the unified opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez. The most popular figure within the opposition had actually been Maria Corina Machado, but the government had disqualified her from running before the election even began. Gonzalez was the candidate who stepped in to replace her. When voting ended, the government-controlled electoral authority declared Maduro the winner. But something was wrong. They never released the detailed voting tallies that would prove it. Venezuela's voting machines print a long paper record at the end of voting, something like a receipt. Known locally as an acta, this document had long been considered the most reliable evidence of any electoral result. Opposition monitors collected these records directly from approximately 80% of polling stations across the country. When compiled, they showed Gonzalez at roughly 67% and Maduro at roughly 30%, the precise opposite of what the government had announced. Multiple American news organizations independently analyzed tens of thousands of these records and verified their authenticity. Pre-election polls, independent exit surveys, and statistical sampling all pointed in the same direction. The Carter Center and other international observer missions concluded that the election had failed to meet international standards and did not reflect the will of the Venezuelan people. The world's response was split. The United States, the European Union, and a significant number of Latin American countries refused to recognize Maduro's victory, while Russia, China, and Iran offered their congratulations. Maduro did not relinquish power. Citizens who protested the result were arrested. Opposition leaders fled the country or went into hiding. This is the first method. Leave the shell of voting intact and steal the numbers inside. 4 years earlier, when Belarus's Lukashenko declared he had won 80% of the vote, the method was identical. People had clearly cast their ballots. Those ballots simply were not counted honestly. The second method, the lie that refuses to lose. The second method comes from the opposite direction. This time, the attack does not come from the party holding power. It comes from the party that has just lost it. In this case, the count is not manipulated. The election is conducted fairly. But the losing side refuses to accept the result and instead declares the election was stolen. The United States in 2020 is the defining example. The losing side claimed that massive fraud had taken place, but dozens of lawsuits were dismissed in court after court. Election authorities across multiple states, and even the losing side's own Justice Department, stated publicly that they had found no evidence of fraud sufficient to overturn the result. The claim nonetheless refused to die, and in January 2021, it culminated in supporters storming the United States Capitol. A near-identical scene played out in Brazil in 2022. Supporters of the narrowly defeated candidate challenged the integrity of the country's electronic voting machines. And in January of the following year, crowds descended on the Capitol's legislature, Supreme Court, and presidential palace, causing significant damage. In some ways, the second method is more insidious than the first. The first method requires actual fraud to function. The second requires nothing but doubt. Simply making people distrust the result is enough to crack the promise that voting represents. And once planted, this distrust does not easily dissolve, even when courts rule against it repeatedly. It hardens into conviction in the minds of millions. In the process, the election administrators who did nothing more than announce the genuine result were branded as traitors and subjected to threats. When telling the truth becomes dangerous in itself, that is the deepest wound this second method leaves behind. A ghost returns. Korea's winter. This second ghost shook Korea in the winter of 2024. Claims of election fraud were not new in Korea. After the 2020 general election, certain factions had alleged that the vote had been rigged. But those claims were never substantiated by any investigation, faded over time, and were consistently rejected by the courts. Then, on the night of December 3rd, 2024, those forgotten claims were revived in a manner that would have been difficult to imagine. The sitting president declared a state of emergency, martial law, the first in 45 years. And the troops he deployed moved not only toward the National Assembly, but also toward the offices of the National Election Commission, the body responsible for administering Korean elections. The then defense minister later stated that troops had been sent to the commission in order to assess whether the alleged election fraud warranted investigation. In other words, fraud that no court had ever recognized was now being pursued with soldiers. Sending the military to the National Election Commission is not an ordinary matter. The commission exists for one purpose only: to count votes and officially certify their results. It is, in effect, the referee of democracy itself. Attempting to seize that referee at gunpoint amounted to declaring that, since the results were unacceptable, the counting itself would be overturned. Here, the story turns. On that same night, lawmakers made their way past the soldiers blocking the building, climbing over walls to get inside. One opposition leader live-streamed the scene as it unfolded. Citizens who heard the news flooded toward the National Assembly in the middle of the night and watched it all happen in real time. The lawmakers who gathered there voted unanimously, across party lines, to lift the martial law declaration. 6 hours after it was proclaimed, it collapsed. What followed was consistent with this. The allegations of election fraud were examined and found to be without merit by the courts and by the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court ruled explicitly that the conspiracy theory could not constitute a valid justification for martial law, and in April 2025 removed the president from office. 2 months later, in June, Korea held a new presidential election. Approximately 80% of eligible voters turned out, the highest participation rate since 1997. The losing candidate conceded. The point worth noting is this. When the promise of voting was attacked by the military, the means by which Korea defended it was, in the end, voting itself. A single vote cast over a wall, and tens of millions of ballots placed in boxes months later. Paper won against guns. The third threat. Not fraud, but failure. Korea's story has a postscript. Barely a year after voting had been defended, an entirely different kind of test arrived. This time, there was no manipulation, no coup. On June 3, 2026, Korea held nationwide local elections. During the afternoon of voting day, ballot papers ran out at a number of polling stations, concentrated especially in Seoul's Songpa and Gangnam districts. Of the approximately 14,000 polling stations across the country, more than 100 ran short of ballots, and at around 20 of them, replacement supplies did not arrive in time, bringing voting to a temporary halt. Citizens who had come to cast their vote were forced to wait for hours or turn around and go home. The cause was not fraud. It was a failure of administration. More voters showed up than had been anticipated, and the supply of ballots was insufficient. Additional stock arrived late. The Secretary General of the National Election Commission apologized that night, and the commission's chairperson resigned in the days that followed. We have already examined two kinds of attacks that undermine the promise of voting, one that steals from above and one that lies from below. Here is a third danger, and this one is not even an attack. It is failure. In other words, incompetence. This was not election fraud. It was election negligence. Nobody stole any votes. But something clearly went wrong. The state failed to give some of its citizens the opportunity to vote at all. And a failure that prevents people from voting wounds the symbol just as deeply as manipulation does. Because the promise of voting is not only that your ballot will be counted honestly, but that you will be able to cast it in the first place. And it is at precisely this point that the two threads of this story converge. The administrative failure was real, and the anger of the citizens was legitimate. People demanded accountability and called for new elections. But into that legitimate anger, the old election fraud conspiracy theories began seeping back in. Some pointed to matching vote totals in two adjacent districts as supposed evidence of manipulation, a coincidence that is fully explained by basic statistics. Some protesters, for their part, drew clear lines between themselves and the conspiracy theorists, and made deliberate efforts to keep the focus on the real problem. This is why failure is dangerous. Incompetence and manipulation are not the same thing. But incompetence cracks public trust, and through that crack, those who profit from suspicion find their opening. When a state fails to run an election cleanly and competently, it does not only wrong the citizens who were denied their vote, it hands a weapon to everyone who benefits from doubt. The investigation into this incident is still ongoing, and whether new elections will be held has not yet been decided. Paper is not strong. We simply choose to protect it. So we return to the question we began with. How does a piece of paper bring down a government or hold one up? The answer is not that the paper is strong. It is that enough people chose to respect it. Judges who accepted the count. Lawmakers who climbed over walls to cast their vote. Citizens who came back to the polls. The power of voting is built from these choices, accumulated. And the choosing does not end. Every time an election is held, the question of whether that promise will be honored is put to the test again. And here is the uncomfortable truth embedded in all of this. If protecting voting is a matter of human choice, then that choice can always be withdrawn. In any country, the promise of voting is only valid for as long as people continue to treat it as a promise. The moment that agreement begins to waver, even the oldest democracy finds that its paper is just paper again. In whatever country you are watching this from, your vote stands on exactly the same promise. The reason a ballot is so powerful, and the reason it is so fragile, are in the end the same reason. Its strength depends entirely on whether we keep choosing to believe in it.